mode.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's broadcast. This webinar is being brought to you by the State Federal RPS Collaborative, which is managed by the Clean Energy States Alliance. Today's topic is net metering. And to begin with, I'd like to go over a quick housekeeping slide. All of our participants today will be in listen-only mode throughout the broadcast, so we will not be able to hear you, but hopefully you can hear us. You can connect to the audio portion of the webinar using your computer speakers or a headset, or you can listen in via telephone. We recommend using your computer speakers to avoid telephone charges, but if you are listening by phone today, we ask that you please enter the audio PIN into your telephone keypad. You should see that on your webinar console on your screen. And today we are encouraging all of our webinar participants to please type your questions into the question box on your webinar console. You can do this at any time during today's broadcast. We encourage you to ask your questions as they come to you. We will queue up all of your questions and they will be answered as time allows following all of our presentations today. And this webinar is being recorded. You will find it online later this afternoon at the web address on your screen, CESA.org/webinars. And now I would like to introduce Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of CESA, and he is the Director of the State Federal RPS Collaborative. Warren, please go ahead.
Hey, thanks very much, Samantha. For those of you who don't know, the Clean Energy States Alliance is a national nonprofit organization, and we work to implement smart clean energy policies. And at the core of our organization is a national network of more than 20 public agencies across the country that are individually and collectively working to advance clean energy. And if you could go to the next slide, we also, as Samantha mentioned, coordinate the RPS Collaborative. The RPS Collaborative is made possible because of grants from the Energy Foundation and the U.S. Department of Energy. Through the collaborative, state RPS administrators, federal agency representatives, and any other stakeholder interested in the wonderful world of RPS can participate and receive a monthly newsletter, be on a mailing list to learn about webinars such as this one, read the reports and documents we produce, and attend the National Summit on RPS that we put on every year, and which occurred in Washington, D.C. in December. If you want to sign up to make sure you receive notices of future webinars, just go to the link at the bottom, or you can go to the CESA.org website and you'll find it there. So let me tell you about today's webinar. If you could go to the next slide. We're going to deal with a hot topic, net metering, and what it means. And to this hot topic, we're going to, we hope, bring some calm, cool, rational thought and some good ideas. We have two speakers who will be talking to us today. Jim Kennerly will be going first. I'm going to introduce him now, and I will introduce Susan Glick before her presentation, which will take place after Jim's. We'll go through both presentations. We'll then leave time for questions. There should be at least 15 or 20 minutes for questions, so type in your questions at any time, and I will ask them of the speakers at the end. So let me tell you about Jim Kennerly. He's a senior policy analyst at the North Carolina Energy Technology Center, which used to be the North Carolina Solar Energy Center. He's been at the center since May 2013, and he focuses primarily on research into government incentives, utility incentives, and regulatory policies affecting clean energy development. He previously worked for the North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association and for ICF International. He received a Master's of Public Affairs degree from the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas. And he's co-author of the report, Rethinking Standby and Fixed Cost Charges, Regulatory and Rate Design Pathways to Deeper Solar Cost Reductions. And many of the ideas he's going to be talking about today come from that report. So let's take it away, Jim.
Thanks very much, Warren. Just get control of this. All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming today. Again, my name is Jim Kennerly. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center. So just a little bit about the Clean Energy Technology Center. Our energy policy team is we're currently the managers of the DESIRE project. So that's the database of state incentives for renewables and efficiency. And a subset of us also work on Sunshot Initiative policy work through something called the Sunshot Solar Outreach Partnership. The Solar Outreach Partnership, or Solar Ops for short, is what funded this work, and most of the work associated with that grant is intended to, and with all Sunshot Initiative work, is to help reduce the non-hardware soft costs of going solar. So a little bit more about solar ops. So currently, non-hardware or soft costs represent about 64% of the total cost of a rooftop solar PV system. So what that means in everyday terms is that the hardware of the system, meaning the module, the inverter, so everything that can be manufactured is only 36% of the cost of the system. The other costs can include the cost of customer acquisition and marketing. It can be the cost of permitting and interconnection, the cost of installation labor, and all sorts of other costs that are keeping solar PV somewhat higher than its hardware cost, and therefore keeping it a little bit higher than it would otherwise be. So lower soft costs really mean, in a lot of ways, a lower cost of incentives that governments and utilities can provide to clean energy systems, and particularly solar PV systems, and they can make these projects more affordable without incentives. And also, the most important in many ways is easier access to capital and finance, as well as easier access for solar PV companies to market their products to customers, and thus customers accept solar and be more aware of what solar is as an investment. I went one too far. If I can just go back. All right. So how do soft costs and the hardware costs associated with going solar, how do they relate exactly to the net metering discussion, you might wonder? Well, it's fairly simple. Net metering is something that most folks in the solar industry, a number of different customers, as well as a number of electric utilities, they're very familiar with net energy metering as a way to compensate customers. So helping those customers to send the energy that they generate that exceeds the amount that they need at any given time back to their utility at the retail rate. So our findings were that changing net metering dramatically through putting in place what are known as standby charges or fixed cost recovery charges could increase customer acquisition and marketing costs, which is one of the largest soft costs, because it would make a lot more customers concerned about going solar and therefore require more time and cost on the side of the installer to help explain those changes and get to a sale with their customers. In addition, the cost of financing would likely increase because the risk profile associated with solar PV, which has to date, if it's a rooftop system, has been able to access in about 44 states the right to net meter and to have that energy sold back be compensated at the retail rate. So if there's a greater financing cost associated with the system, naturally there would be some added risk. There'd be added risk and therefore some added financing cost, and therefore increasing the overall cost of the system. So of course, as many of you might know, net metering has become a very controversial and complex subject at times. But it's also a very important one to be looking at for some proposed solutions as well. So at this point, all parties really do agree that more solar is good, but the difference comes when, you know, stakeholders talk about the value of solar PV and whether solar PV itself reduces utility costs and reduces costs to ratepayers or to customers. So many utilities argue that a subset of customers that can't afford it, for them it's unfair because they can't pay for solar PV themselves, they can't pay $20,000 up front and purchase it outright. And therefore, for those customers, having the lost revenue that the utility earns shifted to them is unfair. However, solar advocates have a rather different perspective. So the solar advocates tend to believe that solar PV reduces costs, overall cost to all utility customers, and so therefore it benefits all customers, and potentially the retail rate for net metering, so having that energy sold back to the utility at the retail rate may actually not be enough compensation. So there's really a very, very polarized viewpoint, and there's definitely, it's definitely created some flashpoints at a number of different state utility commissions and state legislatures across the country. So, to the point of this webinar is how can this kind of tug of war end? One of my favorite business books is a book called Getting to Yes, and one of the key maxims in that book is to focus on interests and not positions. So, if we go back, what these two viewpoints are essentially positions. They're not necessarily the interests of the parties involved. One party's position is that net metering increases costs, and the other's position is that net metering reduces costs. Excuse me. So, what does focusing on interests and not positions really mean? So, I'll give you kind of the Mick Jagger version of this, which is to say you can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you might find you get what you need. And what that really means is that solar PV and utilities need to look at what's in their long-term financial interest and to realize neither one is going away, and that ultimately there needs to be a world and a set of policies that help to reduce the cost of solar, but also give both utilities and solar PV a way to look forward and look forward with confidence. So getting back to this question of value of solar, in many ways what our research found was that using solar cost-benefit analysis in many ways is really helpful. And one of the ways that it's helpful is for planning purposes. So to help understand how valuable of a resource solar PV is at certain places on the grid and overall to all utility customers. However, it does become somewhat problematic when you're talking about utility costs and utility cost allocation, because those costs are what are used to make rates and to make residential rates specifically. Now, residential rates are much more don't necessarily match with utility costs quite as well as, for example, commercial or industrial rates, because residential customers do not pay as many, do not pay as much in the way of demand charges, and they don't pay as much of their fixed costs as others, and they need to recover those costs through energy-based rates. So for the energy they use, they need to pay those fixed costs through their variable usage. So there can be something of a mismatch if rates aren't designed correctly. But what's really important to remember here, and I think this gets lost in the debate in many different moments in time, is that there are many different kinds of cost shifts built into utility rates. So utility rates have, for a long, long time, have other customers paying more so that certain customers paying more so that other customers can pay less. So what do some of these look like? So a good example would be low-income discount programs or low-income energy efficiency programs. Many of these programs don't have to pass cost-effectiveness tests in order to be offered to low-income customers. Another example is industrial customers often pay lower rates that are compensated by residential and commercial customers. And those discounts are intended to add to economic growth and to potentially even retain load. This isn't to say those are necessarily useful or not useful, but it is to say simply that it does involve a shifting of costs from one customer group to another. Other examples are senior citizens discounts, medical baseline discounts, as in California. Probably the most pervasive one is the cost of serving certain customers that are in less dense areas. So the cost of serving customers in Lower Manhattan by Con Edison won't be the same as the cost of serving residential customers in Queens, where they have detached houses as opposed to apartment blocks. And probably, and another major one, and probably one of the most significant ones, is charging rates at average cost. And what that means is that that each month you pay the same amount, or you pay the same amount, in different seasons, for the same amount of energy, even though the cost of that energy varies dramatically throughout the day. So, cost-benefit analysis doesn't take into account the wide variety of cost shifts built into rates. But not only that, cost-benefit analysis involves debating about different categories and saying, do CO2 costs make sense, to be included? Do economic development costs make sense to be included? Which cost-effectiveness tests do we use? And considering how much controversy there is about that in the energy efficiency world, it becomes even more controversial in many ways in the solar PV world as well. So it makes it much harder for solar PV stakeholders, industry advocates, as well, and utilities to come together and agree on something. So the way that we looked at this was somewhat different. What we decided to focus on was objective utility costs instead of these normative values, so more of these sort of subjective or opinion-based values of solar PV. So this is really what might help look at overall rate reform, not just looking at solar PV's role in net energy metering. So what are these different utility cost categories? The first one is demand-related costs. So these costs, they vary with how much a customer demands, what their peak demand is throughout the month or the year. So the utility has to build its system to meet that in many cases. And so those are costs that they have to incur. So a share of the different power plants or production plants, as well as transmission and distribution infrastructure, is part of these demand-related costs. Another set is energy-related costs. Energy-related costs, unlike demand-related costs, are 100% variable, or at least very close to 100% variable, because they vary only with customer energy usage. And the same is true with power and production plant costs, transmission distribution. There's a share of those that vary with energy use, whereas others vary with demand. But the cost of fuel, the cost of, for example, uranium or coal or natural gas for those plants varies inherently with how much customers use. So that's an energy-related cost. Now, customer-related costs are probably the most basic and unavoidable by definition, because utilities must put a line to your house. They must have a service drop, which is a line to your house. The cost of metering has to be passed on to you, because you must have a utility meter if you receive any service whatsoever from the utility. You must be billed if you receive service from the utility. And there's a chunk of the distribution system that is totally unavoidable, regardless of how much energy you use. So these are the three major cost categories that utilities look at when they put together what's called a cost of service study. So this is what we thought was the best approach in terms of finding a little bit more of a middle ground on net metering. So what exactly does that approach entail? The approach that we came up with was fairly simple, if not, interrelated. So it's mainly a three-step approach. The first step is revenue decoupling. So to decouple the sale of electricity from the revenue that the utility makes, to recommend a minimum monthly contribution, often known colloquially as a minimum bill, which all customers would have to pay. And to go back to revenue decoupling, that actually would be assessed in the form of a fee that most customers would pay, that all customers would pay as well. We'll get into each one of these individually in future slides, but I just want to go through these. And then also to put in place time of use rates or some kind of rate that just simply reflects the varying cost of electricity at different times of use. So the first step really, and I think sequentially it makes the most sense to go through these in a stepwise manner and to implement them in a stepwise manner. The first one is to put in place revenue decoupling. So revenue decoupling, in essence, allows a utility to make its return on equity and to make its revenue requirements, whether it sells enough electricity or sells as much electricity as it was expecting to in the absence of energy efficiency or any kind of distributed energy resource. So having no decoupling has led to utilities losing money, especially as more distributed energy resources have gone out on the grid. So a really good example of this, if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, this is from the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory's most recent report on net metering impacts on utilities. The base case of the utility, in the case of of using more distributed energy resources, the utility tends to lose money. So there's different cases there. I won't get into exactly what those are all about, but those cases show that there are utility revenue losses associated with distributed energy resources. This is totally unsurprising, especially if the utility doesn't have revenue decoupling. But what you can see there is if it does have revenue decoupling in place and it can boost its revenue requirement through different rates and charges to make sure that it gets to a place of earning its fixed and variable costs, the utility can actually make money in the case of having more distributed energy resources. So this really is a step that's sort of a broad-based step, and it's a much more fundamental step on a utility's part to ensure that it can provide its investors with confidence that it will remain a good investment in the long run. And many different utilities have considered this, and Susan will get into this later, but National Grid, the utility that Task had worked with a bit in Massachusetts, and also Northeast utilities, those utilities are required to engage in revenue decoupling. So those utilities are already well positioned to implement some of the suggestions we have here. So the second step in many ways, and this is to recover the customer-related costs. So remember we talked about demand, energy, and customer-related costs. So to recover those customer-related costs, probably the best approach and the most flexible approach is to put in place what's called a minimum bill. So a minimum bill is really just a floor. It's essentially a minimum amount of electricity that a residential customer would pay each month, regardless of how much solar output they had and how large or small their utility bill was. It's just to make sure that they are covering what are called those customer-related costs. So why is it important to cover those customer-related costs? Well, even if you use nothing, the utility is still needing to recover certain costs and to recover those costs in order to remain whole. And this is even if you use absolutely nothing. So not even no net energy, it's just simply using no energy whatsoever. So many utilities have what are called basic facilities charges, and these are fixed cost charges for all customers. So for example, and you'll see in the picture here, I came up with a hypothetical utility that has a $8 a month fixed charge. So regardless of how much energy the customer uses, they will pay $8 a month. So California, for example, has what's called a minimum bill in place, which is to say they don't have a fixed charge, but it ensures though that each customer pays a certain minimum amount per month. So this allows for certain things to happen. So when you have a fixed charge in place, it reduces the amount of volumetric rate that the customer can use to offset an energy efficiency or solar PV investment. So that often can, you've probably heard people say, well, that just discourages energy efficiency and conservation. Well, that's why. It's because having a higher fixed charge means that that you can have a lower energy rate, and therefore a lot of conservation and solar PV related investments will not necessarily be as good of an investment. So, but a minimum bill makes a lot of sense because most customers, as you can see in this picture, actually pay more than the minimum amount necessary to cover those customer-related costs. So most solar PV customers, so what was used in this example was 1,000 kWh per month customers. So they use 1,000 kilowatt hours a month, and they offset 70, 80, 90, 95, and 100% of their energy. What you can see is that only the customers that offset 95% of their energy in this hypothetical example didn't pay their minimum costs. So having a minimum bill in place just makes sure that they cover that minimum cost, but doesn't otherwise diminish or harm their savings or harm the utility's ultimate revenue recovery. So the third and probably one of the most important steps, especially if you're talking about customers that are using some net energy from the grid, is to put in place default time of use pricing. So when I say default, it simply means that the customer has to opt out and use something different. But otherwise, they would be required, if they took no other action, to pay what are called time of use rates. So as many folks probably know, the cost of energy on peak is quite a bit higher than the cost of energy off peak, because the cost that the utility is incurring to generate energy or to purchase energy on the market is much higher when there's greater demand, of course, for energy. So, but what time of use pricing can do is ensure, and this can be a design choice, is a utility can design a tariff, design a rate plan for customers that have solar PV and even customers that do not, because almost every customer that uses energy inconsistently is being, in essence, cross-subsidized or having cost shifted away from them and to the customer that uses energy more consistently. And so when there's greater consistency in energy usage because the customer that needs it on peak is paying more for it, there's much greater consistency in energy use, much greater consistency in the cost of serving all of the utilities customers. And not only that, a solar PV customer can get a good deal of benefit from this arrangement because they can pay, or can be paid, I should say, for the energy they sell back on peak, which is a great deal higher than the average cost of energy. So if you see there on that graph, not only would a solar PV customer pay the true cost of serving them on peak, so say if their PV system is not performing during their monthly system peak, they would pay for that energy without paying an added fixed charge, but can ultimately pay for their true cost of service. So the principle here was not that solar PV customers would not pay for the true cost of serving them. It's just that it would be done in a way that is not as harmful to solar PV and to soft cost reduction. So let's go back through and look at demand, energy, and customer-related costs and how these approaches match up. So revenue decoupling helps to recover all three kinds of costs. A minimum bill helps to recover customer-related costs or demand-related costs, depending on how you design the minimum bill. So, default time of use pricing looks really at demand-related and energy-related costs, and uses really the billing determinant of the kilowatt hour as opposed to the kilowatt or something else that's fixed that the residential customer does not nearly have as much control over. So I just want to give a quick example of how fixed charges and kind of the sort of status quo approach to greater utility cost recovery from solar PV customers are going. So this is kind of how it hasn't gone terribly well to date, and kind of how it's a good example of how it's not the current approach is not particularly well suited to the viability of solar PV. So there's several utilities in Wisconsin right now that are trying to add a fixed charge that, it's not exactly adding, it's more that they are trying to put in place a fixed charge that covers all of those, remember, customer-related costs. So what they're doing is they're putting in place a charge that's in the teens or something like that, as opposed to the low single digits. And then what that does is that changes the volumetric per kilowatt hour rate that a solar PV customer can sell its energy back at, or a non-solar customer can benefit from energy efficiency from. But not only that, they've gone further and said, let's put in place a demand charge on specifically on solar PV customers. So what I decided to do was kind of take a quick look at how this affects a customer in Milwaukee. So I picked one of these utilities and focused on Milwaukee. And so what was simulated here was, in essence, the cost, the different scenarios of cost that the utility could pass on to its customers and how they could design their rates through the rate case that's going on at the moment. So the finding was here that most customers, just as I showed you on our minimum bill slide, actually were paying enough to cover the amount of minimum necessary revenue that this utility said that solar PV customers needed to pay and were not currently paying. And not only that, I went even further and took a look at how much did the same customer using, I shouldn't say the same customer, but a customer that used the same amount of energy but just simply didn't have solar PV, how much did that customer pay relative to a solar customer? Because the principle is that a solar customer shouldn't pay more than a customer that did not have solar. That shouldn't happen. So let's just go through the results a little bit. So what you see there is a series of different cases. The red line on top was the proposal from this utility in Wisconsin. And as you can see, and down on the bottom, so the increasing line at the bottom is the minimum charge that, or the minimum amount of money that the utility needed from that customer. So this is what, you can go through the testimony and it says simply, this is how much we need to earn from solar customers and we're not getting it. So this is, I mean, it's very clear that they said this is what they need. So it was helpful as a baseline of what they needed as a utility. And so what you see here on the top red line is how much a customer with the average usage in Milwaukee, so the base kind of house, the average kind of house with a 3 kilowatt, a 4 kilowatt, a 5 kilowatt, and 6 kilowatt system paid as a utility bill. So as you see, the 3 kilowatt customer paid $80 under the utility's proposal. So currently, if they did not change anything related to fixed charges or demand charges, they'd pay $70. So they're already over-recovering something like $45. But in the case of putting in place the charge, it'd be about $55. Go up to the 6 kilowatt. Obviously, once you get to 7 or 8, yes, there does come a point at which they're not recovering enough. And that's a good example of where putting some kind of minimum floor or minimum bill in place would make a lot of sense. But as you can see, at all levels that I took a look at and I simulated using the system advisor model, at all levels, the customer was paying enough to cover the minimum amount the utility said it needed to pay for its fixed costs. So to go even further, this is how much more a customer with solar would pay relative under the red line proposal up there on the top, would pay relative to a customer that did not have solar but used the exact same amount of energy. So what you're seeing here is solar customers actually paying more than the same amount, than a similarly situated non-solar customer. So that really shouldn't happen. I mean, that really isn't intended to be the consequence of rate making. It isn't to ensure that someone who's trying to conserve is actually being penalized for conservation. So just a few ways to avoid some pitfalls, and we can move on. it makes the most sense to reform all rates and not just look at solar customer rates. Because remembering that there's all sorts of cost shifts built into customer rates. The other is that in the Wisconsin example is a good one. It shows that actual customer billing data is necessary to ensure that many of these requests are in essence meritorious and needing to recover. That the utilities are needing to recover this amount of money from each customer per month. And not only that, providing options for solar customers, but also for non-solar customers as well, is very important. So there's a number of different ways that we can take a look at demand-related, energy-related costs, and customer-related costs to ensure the customers are getting what they are paying what they are, what the utility incurred in terms of serving them and their cost of service, but also benefiting from solar PV. So that's mostly it for me. You can find our report online at our North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center website. Thanks very much.
Hey, thanks very much, Jim. There are some questions that have come in for you, but we're going to wait till after the second presentation. And I'm going to introduce our second speaker, who will have a relatively briefer presentation than Jim's, which will leave us some time for questions. And this is Susan Glick, who's Senior Manager for Public Policy at Sunrun. She's also a spokesperson for the Alliance for Social Choice, which is a national rooftop solar advocacy organization. At Sunrun, she oversees all strategic communications and media relations for the Sunrun Public Policy team, and she previously managed corporate communications for the company. Well, with that, let me turn it over to Susan and to talk about the perspective of the Alliance for Solar Choice and also talk about what happened over this last year in the state of Massachusetts. Susan.
Thanks, Warren. So I thought after Jim's great overview there, it would be good to just look at a few examples of where minimum bills are being discussed nationally and how, and just a few case studies for the implementation, just how those conversations are taking shape. So Sam, if you just want to advance to the next slide here. So over the summer, there were a number of items that sort of launched this discussion of minimum bills into more of a national sphere. There were a couple of reports, one by Green Tech Media, another one is Jim's report, both of which discuss how minimum bills are much better than any kind of fixed charge, and talked about it within the context of utilities and solar companies being able to come together around that concept. Another item that I wanted to highlight is the actual coming together of utilities and solar companies on that concept. So the CEO of my company, Sunrun, joined up with Marcy Reed, who's the president of National Grid, and together they authored a piece about how minimum bills is really the way to bring the two sides together, in spite of the fact that there have been these high-pitched battles over the past 18 months about the future of rooftop solar. So it's just a very interesting case study of this concept in action. And I want to just go a little bit deeper into Massachusetts. Sam, if you would go to the next slide, that would be great. Great. So in Massachusetts, we were in August, looked at S2214. I guess it passed July 1st, but this really did spark national conversation about minimum bills. It also extended the state's net metering cap. So you see here this emphasis on maintaining net metering within the context of putting a minimum bill in place. And so now the discussion of minimum bills has been inserted into the regulatory process through a Green Ribbon Commission. And this all goes towards growing the rooftop solar market, trying to sort of stop the high-pitched nature of the battles or stop battles altogether that are happening between utilities and solar companies, and get towards state goals, state renewable energy goals, economic growth goals, etc., that can come from increased rooftop solar deployment. And then further to that, just listening to what consumers want, and voters and ratepayers in these states are calling out for the ability and the choice for rooftop solar. So it's bringing everybody to a common ground there. And again, you know, this Boston Globe article, I will just call out a key part. You know, it's calling it a landmark bill in the Massachusetts legislature. It's the first major example of our two sides finding comprehensive common ground on solar policy. And it's just quite remarkable given the nature of these discussions across the country. And regarding the rest of the country, the next slide will just give a few additional examples of states that have either put minimum bills under consideration through legislative or regulatory mandate or have a minimum bill currently in place. So the first of those was California's AB 327 that presented discussion of a minimum bill as an option for the state as they look to future rate design and discussions around rooftop solar. Similarly, in Kansas, HB 2101 maintains net metering, and it also allows for the consideration of minimum bills. In Oklahoma, there's an executive order from the governor that also calls for the examination of minimum bills and highlights minimum bills as, you know, an important consideration. And then, of course, Massachusetts is one that we already discussed. And then as far as existing minimum bills go, in Hawaii, HECO has one, and it's working quite well. HECO, or Hawaii in general, is almost like a glimpse into the future because solar penetration is so high there in comparison to the rest of the country. And on HECO's last earnings call, their own CEO highlighted that minimum bills are working. So it's a good example of that mechanism being in place and being successful. And further to that, the Alliance for Solar Choice, supported by a few other groups in Hawaii, the Hawaii PV Coalition, Hawaii Solar Energy Association, Cross Border Energy, actually filed a paper with the PUC that's a policy paper on customer solutions for the energy future. And it walks through this vision of, you know, how do we continue to maintain customer-focused policies that support a strong rooftop solar future. And a minimum bill is one of the things that's discussed. So that's an interesting thing to look at if folks want to see more discussion around that. And that's about it for my rundown of just a couple of quick case studies and just a little bit of emphasis on how these discussions are taking shape nationally. And Lauren, I will hand it back to you. I'm sure folks have questions. And
yeah, thank you very much, Susan. That's good
You're
to
welcome.
know, and we have a number of questions I want to ask. And the first one is probably the fundamental question, and actually two different people wrote in with variants of this. What is the difference between fixed charges and a minimum bill? And what is it about that difference that make minimum bills so much better than fixed charges?
Sure, that's a great question, Warren. I can start, and Jim, or Jim, feel free to start, but either way.
Well, Susan, why don't you start since you've started, and then Jim could add in.
Sure. The way that I think is easy to think about it is electricity bill. It doesn't impose any additional tax, anything on top of what you already pay. So if you pay $20 a month for electricity and your state has a minimum bill of $2 a month, right, you've met that minimum bill in your electricity payments and you don't pay anything further. However, if you had a fixed charge, it would be like a tax on top of what you already pay. So if you paid $20 a month and there were a $2 fixed charge, you'd pay $22 a month. So it's fundamentally a floor on your electricity bill versus a tax that's you know, in many cases discriminatory across customers that are choosing to install rooftop solar.
Jim, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that's about right. I mean, it's just making sure that it's really looking at the question of, did the customer pay enough money in the first place, and how does the customer pay that money? And in the case of a minimum bill, if they are doing something to conserve energy, or for example putting solar on their rooftop, it helps offset their utility bill at a higher rate on average to have a minimum bill than a higher fixed charge, because the fixed charge reduces the energy rate, so the variable rate of energy that you purchase from the utility. So it does have more of a sort of incentive to help conserve energy to have that in place. And also, as some of the analysis I was showing, I think kind of showed, was that most customers actually do pay that bill already. So it's not really a question of paying that minimum amount of fixed charge. It's about paying for it's about, in essence, how that charge is paid for and how accurate that calculation is.
Yeah, but let me give a hypothetical example here of a solar customer who has a system on his or her roof that over the course of the year generates the exact amount of electricity as they use. And through net metering, if there was no fixed charge or there was no minimum bill, they would be paying nothing to the utility under net metering. Why would they, if there was either a fixed charge of $10 a month or a minimum bill of $10,000 a month for that customer, wouldn't they be paying the same thing?
That's a great point, Warren, and that's why I was saying for most customers are already paying that amount. So most customers that have a net energy bill, so they're getting some net energy from the utility, the minimum bill really wouldn't apply to them almost at all. It would act as a fixed charge at the zero net energy point, but it wouldn't be, but otherwise it wouldn't reduce the savings that the customer would receive.
So it seems like what you're saying is the big advantage for solar customers of the minimum bill approach is that solar customers who are still using some electricity from the grid are not being hit with that charge, where if there was a fixed charge, whether they were using electricity from the grid or not, they would still be hit with it. Is that fair enough to say?
I'd say that's fair. I mean, I think it's not, it's simply a choice in how you design the rates. It's whether you want to have that rate, you're ensuring that the customer pays that amount, or you're flexibly allowing the customer's usage to cover that amount is a different way of saying it. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just to put in context, the vast majority of net metered rooftop solar customers, at least that we've seen, still pay a monthly bill to the utility company.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, I have some other questions here.
Yeah.
This one's for Jim. And this goes back to your chart about the Wisconsin example, and this person says, wanted to make sure he understood what you were saying. Are you saying that the solar customer usually pays enough to cover both fixed costs and the cost of whatever kilowatt hours they use?
So what I'm saying there is that if you look at the testimony of what the folks from that utility were saying is that we were not recovering, and we being the utility, we were not recovering enough energy, or I'm sorry, enough revenue from solar PV customers to cover our most basic charges and our basic costs of serving customers. And they were saying that all solar customers were, in essence, responsible for that happening. And what I was trying to show there was just simply that many, if not most, solar customers, to Susan's point, were actually paying that amount. That's what I was trying to show. Or at least using simulated National Renewable Energy Laboratory load data, not actual customer load data.
And can I just add something on Wisconsin?
Yeah, please.
just some news that came out last week. And Jim, I don't know which utility you looked at, but something that's interesting that's happening now in Wisconsin is that the most egregious of the fixed charge proposals is from We Energies. And at the same time, there was a report that was just unearthed that was a study that We Energies commissioned that actually contradicts their claims about solar. So it shows that rooftop solar is a financial benefit to all ratepayers. And so it just meshes nicely with what you were saying about the utility actually does recover even from solar customers, and the utility's own study has pointed to that, which is just an interesting new development there.
Good. And Susan, I have a question for you. This person writes in and says, you seem to support Jim's recommendation about a minimum bill, but how does the solar community feel about his other two recommendations having to do with decoupling and variable pricing?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I think that you do have to look at rates holistically. There are a lot of states currently that have revenue decoupling, and there are also states that integrate time of use pricing in a good way. So it's just a matter of how you integrate all of that.
Okay, and here's a question for either or both of you. And this is a quite general question about this whole thing about the focus on rooftop solar. And this person writes in and says, since utility scale solar is so much less expensive than rooftop solar, if the goal is cleaner energy, why are we subsidizing through net metering a more expensive solution?
That's an interesting question as well. I think, to that point, I would start by saying that you can't really have any discussion about subsidies without acknowledging sort of what's happening on both sides with regards to incentives. So globally, fossil fuel subsidies are at least 5 times those of renewables. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're having subsidies discussions. And rooftop solar has been shown to be a net financial benefit to all ratepayers. You're looking at a lot of different metrics when you consider the quote-unquote costs and benefits, and it's not the same measure or metric or methodology when you're looking at utility-scale solar versus the benefits of rooftop solar.
Yeah, and I would just add, I obviously, we're focused on, kind of the clean energy side of things here at the center, but one thing I'll just note is that it is true certainly that utility scale is less expensive per unit of cost, but in many cases there's only, I believe, about 10 to 11 states at this point that allow for what's called virtual net metering, so allowing for the ability to net meter on a bill, a customer bill that's from a system that's not on site. So so a lot of community solar applications in those states would be essentially a net metered system. And so I think it's just to the point that customers are not able to access that lower cost solar PV because it's not legal to do so in their states.
And I'll just have a quick example of sort of the differences in metrics, right? When you have utility scale solar, that has to be transported across transmission and distribution lines, and that infrastructure has to be built out. When you are looking at rooftop solar, any energy that's fed back onto the grid, the utility can sell at the full retail rate to the solar customer's neighbor, and that's a big consideration for on-site distributed solar and the way that it can save and certain metrics that would go into a calculation there outside of just fuel cost.
Good. And Susan, if I could point out, for some reason your sound was getting a little soft, so if you could speak a little louder with your next answers.
Sure. Sorry about that.
For either of you. And this is, in our jurisdictions, not all fixed costs are covered in the customer service charge. regulators have made the policy decision that higher variable charges encourage customers to conserve. If the rate design includes a higher customer service charge for all customers, wouldn't they have less incentive to conserve?
Well, I can speak to that a little bit. And that person is correct. It is not the customer-related charges. The fixed, essentially, the customer charge doesn't, in all cases, recover all of the customer-related expenses. However, what our report was suggesting, at least on the Clean Tech Center side, was suggesting was that we look at options like decoupling and time of use pricing to ensure that if a customer is not using, is not benefiting from solar PV production during peak, that they would be paying the true cost of serving that customer at that time. So the intent of this proposal was to recover the full cost of service from that customer of that use at that time. So that person is definitely correct, but the proposal is intended to kind of, at least on the Clean Tech Center side, is intended to cover that.
Okay. And another person asked, doesn't assuming a customer with a total bill larger than the minimal bill, the assumption that that person pays the fixed cost, doesn't that assume that all of the usage charges are available to pay those fixed costs? Doesn't it ignore the usage-based costs?
Can you repeat the question, Warren? I'm not sure.
I think what this person was saying, in your Wisconsin example, when you say that the customer with the bill larger than the minimum is paying all the, maybe this isn't the Wisconsin example, that person is paying the fixed costs, aren't you assuming that all the usage charges are going towards those fixed costs rather than paying for the energy the customer is getting from the grid? Or did you factor in terms of figuring whether that customer was paying their full share, both the fixed charges of the grid plus any usage that the person was taking from it?
Sure. So what this utility did was, in testimony, very clearly said, this is what we need to recover from this type of customer, and saying this is what we need, and it wasn't put in context of, well, we were getting something, but there's still something else we want to get, or aren't getting. I mean, it wasn't put in that context. What it simply said was, this is what we need to recover. So clearly, if there's something there that wasn't fully explained, then yeah, I would change the analysis. But I think what the purpose of having something like time of use pricing or something like decoupling would be to ensure that the utility is able to recover its necessary revenue requirement, and so it could either get that through usage charges or a minimum bill, or both, preferably both.
Okay. I have one last question, and then I'll give you each opportunity to have any famous last words for 1 minute each. The last question, you mentioned the We Energy report that discusses the value of solar. Do either of you know how someone could find that?
Sure. I could send it to them. And
so what does We stand for?
We Energy.
We Energy. So presumably, if they just Google We Energy, solar.
So I don't know if you Googled We Energy's study solar, you'd see some articles in the newspapers about this study. It was conducted by Clean Power Research. I'm not sure if it's in the regulatory docket or if it's filed for this rate case in particular, or if it was unearthed separately. But I can ask my colleague who focuses on Wisconsin and route that information to you, Warren, or I can...
Well, how about if the person who asked that question, they could email you, Susan, and you could maybe follow up if they have difficulty finding it. So with that, let me give each of you an opportunity to say anything you want to either wrap up or to say that you haven't had a chance to say yes. Either of you have anything else you want to add?
I would just say, thanks for bringing us together for this discussion, and if anyone has additional questions, they can feel free to contact me directly.
Yeah, I would just say the same, and if you all are trying to look for the copy of the report that the Clean Tech Center did on this issue, you also could Google something like Rethinking Standby charges, and I think it'll probably be the first hit. I would guess it would be the first hit, but otherwise, yes, thank you so much for coming, and have a pleasant rest of the day.
Well, let me follow up on Samantha, who coordinates these webinars, just had a good idea. In the follow-up email that will go out to all participants, we will include a link to both Jim, your report, and to the We Energy study, assuming, Susan, you're able to identify it. And if folks want to, after the webinar, go back and see it, it's available on our website at www.cesa.org, and you'll find it there. And I want to thank both Jim and Susan because you're addressing an important topic and doing it in interesting and creative ways. So thanks very much, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks, Warren. Thanks, Jim.